Welcome to the Village Oak Tree. I'm your host, Terrence O'Donnell. Now that the holiday season's passed once again, and the weather outside everywhere is frightful, and not just in North America, I bring you more of the mainstream news that you probably won't find in normal places, at least here in North America. And I give you a bit of an analysis of what's going on around the world. So then after my commercial break, I'll read you another chapter of The Priest from Michael Campy, his dystopian future. So come sit you down next to someplace warm and listen to me tell you some tales from the world outside. So what I have here for this January 8th is more stories, again, you won't find on mainstream news here in the United States. You might get some of it in Canada. But either way, you should know what your tax dollars are doing in foreign countries. And it's kind of a little bit of the theme of what I've got for you this week. Most people by now know that the U.S. has military troops in northeastern Syria to help fight ISIS. So they've been telling everyone for several years now. What I told you before is that the real reason is to guard Chevron while they steal oil from Syria and guard against anyone, including the Syrian people, from having the wheat from their fields there. In other words, they've been starving Assad's, constituency. Now, that's not anything new. The Americans been doing this for a long time now in other places. The latest thing in the independent news is that the U.S. decided that now that Assad is no longer in charge of Syria, and Syria no longer has a credible government, at least in the eyes of the West for now, they can take advantage of the vacuum of power to build up that forward operating base up in the Northeast. So what used to be a low-key spot in the middle of nowhere with maybe some sand berms and wire will now be upgraded with concrete structures and bunkers and a command center and so on, a JSOC and who knows what, a more permanent structure. Just what the taxpayers need, another permanent base and another foreign country to support. How many millions of defense budget dollars will this cost? The government has now admitted that instead of 900, like they said earlier, they have over 2,000 now. And once this base is finished with its upgrades, there's probably going to be a lot more. And how many, now we're going to start running, 6-month deployment rotations. Another story I found on Al Jazeera on Monday, the Pentagon is denying that they're building a new base in Al Arab, but according to a UK-based human rights group that's reporting all this buildup, they are. So who are we going to believe? The Brits or the U.S. Pentagon? Knowing how credible any of these people are, if I had to choose, I would choose the human rights organization, even if they are based in the UK. Imagine being a young soldier and being told, okay, next month, your unit is going to be deployed for Syria for the next 6 months. Much like rotations to Camp Casey in Korea or to Kuwait or Djibouti in Africa or other foreign posts around the world. Syria will just become another forward deployment like so many others. On the other side of Syria, the Israelis are also taking advantage of the power vacuum and rolling out new territory in the southwest, all the way to Damascus. As I said before Christmas, the new government is pretty powerless to stop anyone from doing whatever they please, especially since the Israelis bombed every bit of Syrian military hardware into burning junk. Syria has now become the spoils of war to be divided up between those powers to take what they want. In this case, the U.S. and Israel. The new defector of what's left of Syria is pleading for the larger powers to help get the country back up and running, and the U.S. is only too happy to do so for a price. There were rumors that one of those stipulations was to push the Russians, but al-Jilani said no. Maybe that's why the Americans and the Israelis are taking and destroying whatever they can, while the fledgling government is too weak to do anything about it. Russia can't help as they have their hands full on Ukraine right now. Speaking of Ukraine, there's more news in that arena too. Ukraine is so desperate for troops, they're thinking of capitulating to the American politicians about lowering their draft age again. So they did drop it from 27 to 25 here a couple years ago, but certain American politicians want them to drop it even more down to 18 years. Hey, if it's good enough for the Americans, it should be good enough for everyone else. and they wonder why they have a big desertion problem. Zelensky is admitting that thousands of Ukrainians have deserted the front lines and they can't scrape up enough replacements to replace the dead and the deserters. Ukraine tried to attack Kursk again, but failed miserably this time. What troops that are left on the front lines are beyond tired. Meanwhile, the conscription gangs are continuing to kidnap and beat up anyone that even looks the right age, even using gas to take down a handful of draft protesters that took over a draft office, to protest being drafted. The news over in that part of the world is grim. As everyone has heard, Ukraine shut off the oil and gas to Europe that had been moving through the transit pipes there, basically cutting off their nose to spite their neighbors. Poor countries like Moldova, Serbia, Slovakia, and others are pitching fits. And in the case of the breakaway region of Moldova called Transnistria, they have shut down factories and other facilities and advised people to close off their houses to conserve heat as they shut off all the heat and hot water to their citizens. Other nearby countries want to punish Ukraine somehow. There's talk of shutting off some electricity as one sanction. Others will soon follow as people start freezing. Germany's coalition government has collapsed, waiting for new elections soon. Austria's chancellor resigned in protest over the right-wing nationalists who won seats in their new coalition, which they're trying to gather up and get it together right now. But what this all means is that the right-wingers in Germany, France, and a couple other places, and now maybe even Canada, are starting to gain power. More and more European governments are collapsing. On Sunday, I read that the French farmers are driving their tractors back to Paris to protest Macron's government once again. And that'll jam things up in their parliament area. Italy's Meloni has decided to kiss the Trump ring and swear fealty to the new American king this week. I kid you, but you can bet that she is going there to plead for Trump not to impose tariffs on Italian imports, much like Canada and the others. Trump is probably getting an erection, figuratively, over all this attention. At his age, I doubt he can get it up without some Viagra. How many more world leaders are going to cave and make the trip to the castle in Mar-a-Lago to kiss the new monarch's ring? You can bet that the only Latin American leader who will bend the knee will be Argentina's Milei. Venezuela most certainly won't, and with America's latest spat with Panama, Central America probably won't either. Honduras made the news this week with a story about how they're threatening the U.S. with making them remove their troops from their base there. The Americans have set up a joint base with Honduras to help deal with the cartels and other bad guys down there, but it seems the Americans may have worn out their welcome. This tiff started when Trump told everyone that he was shipping back to their home countries all of the undocumented refugees in the U.S. Honduras has been so impoverished by American foreign policy since the 1980s, they still haven't recovered. They can't afford to take all those refugees back. So their answer is to send the American troops home. Chile is saying the same thing. They can't afford to take care of, refugees that come up to the United States. They don't want them back either. So it's going to be a big problem. So this is starting to become a pattern. Brazil is one of the founding members of the BRICS alliance, and although they trade with the U.S., they don't need them. Other Latin American countries are also telling the U.S., we don't need you anymore. Some more than others, but the message is spreading. If this BRICS alliance continues to gain steam, the U.S. may find themselves even more isolated on the world stage. More and more countries are tired of being bullied and are leaning away from the Americans, especially since there is a new trading bloc out there that's a lot friendlier and easier to deal with. The new trending consensus for after last year is who needs the Americans and the Europeans. There are enough other countries easier to do business with little to no strings attached. China, Russia, and India being the leaders now instead of the West. In other economic trade news, I found a YouTube video that gives a lot of details about how China is moving away from buying North American crude oil and natural gas. They figured out that they can get their oil and gas cheaper elsewhere, primarily with their BRICS trading partners. Imagine the panic going on at a U.S. fossil fuel industry as they're seeing their profits shrink on top of their shrinking oil patches in the U.S. If the fossil fuel industry in the U.S. caves in, that will rip a huge hole in the guts of the American economy. Yeah, Canadians too, for that matter. Once the BRICS alliance gets their trading currency issues worked out, it'll be pretty much game over for the US dollar as the world's reserve trade currency, which will likely be very soon, maybe in the next year or two, if things keep going the way they are. Which brings us to another article about trade issues I found. This one from a writer on medium.com. As everyone who reads or watches the news, including Fox and CNN, it's no secret that the U.S. has become a major supplier of LNG, liquefied natural gas, to Europe now. With Ukraine shutting off the transit lines on January 1st, they're also dependent on the U.S. for LNG now. The Americans are selling this commodity at about a 40% markup, of course. There are strong rumors that this was a deliberate sabotage of the oil and gas systems by the Americans and British in order to set up a near monopoly on LNG in Europe. The idea supposedly was thought of when Russia invaded Ukraine, and the U.S. needed a way to cripple the Russian economy beyond economic sanctions. What better way to convince the Europeans to stop buying cheap oil and gas from the Russians than by blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines, scaring the Europeans by, first, blaming the Russians, then the Ukrainians. What I learned a couple of months ago turns out to be true, that this was indeed the American and British elite SEAL team and SAS combat divers using the USS Wasp as a launching platform to commit this sabotage. It only makes sense. Who benefits the most from this? The Americans and, and by proxy, a little bit of the British. The Americans and their British partners, of course. This constant warfare over oil that's been going on since the 1970s is only going to get more intense as the oil starts running out in certain places. And this was the subject of that article on medium.com I just mentioned. What this writer talks about is how the shale oil deposits in North America are starting to run dry. For a few years now, the Americans and the Canadians have been enjoying a surplus of oil that they can export, especially natural gas. They had this surplus due to new technology that allowed the fossil fuel industry to extract oil from certain shale rock deposits that's very expensive to use, the technology. Not only that, it pollutes the water and the air around these dig sites and has created low-grade earthquakes at times. Those deposits are running dry now. What do you think will happen to the economies in Canada and US when this surplus finally runs out? Knowing what we know based on the past history of the oil wars around the world, the given that the U.S. fossil fuel industry will bribe their state congressional representatives into starting a war somewhere in order to steal their oil, much like what the U.S. and British did in Iraq in 2003, and what the U.S. is doing in Syria right now, what they tried to do in Venezuela until Maduro's nationalized the industry there to prevent the Americans from stealing it. And it really pissed off the American oil companies, and they're still trying to sue the Venezuelans for it right now. Americans have been doing everything they can to reverse that ever since. As I said, Chevron's trying to sue. And so they're they're trying to sue for what they call company assets. In other words, they're saying that, okay, you can keep your oil, but all of that infrastructure to get that oil belongs to us, an American corporation, and you can't have it. Well, that's what the fight's all about. The latest was the recent elections in Venezuela last year. The Americans sent in the CIA to interfere in their elections and set up a patsy as an opposition candidate in order for the U.S. to take over the oil patches there. They were foiled, and the CIA-backed candidate is still on the run. Although it looks like Argentina may let him in, according to the latest story. To show you just how complicit the Americans are in all of this, all the way to the top, the outgoing President Biden met up with this opposition leader within the last day or so to show support. It doesn't get more blatant than that. In the Gulf oil states, they know the oil is starting to run low, and they're diversifying their economies a little more. Saudi Arabia is trying to stay neutral and trade with everybody. They still have plenty of oil, but they've admitted that they know it's finite. The same goes for the other Gulf states. UAE started running out of oil decades ago and moved on to other things that make lots of money, such as investing it heavily in Dubai. The rest are still idly sitting by, pumping oil to anyone with enough money to pay for it, for as long as there's oil to pump. The Americans are getting a little desperate, and the Canadians know this, which is why, as I told everyone in a previous show, Alberta is going all out to make nice with Trump in order to keep the pipelines open to the U.S. They need the money. They still have plenty of shale oil up there, but it's cheaper to sell it to the Americans than to ship it overseas. And they don't get along with China or India right now. Although that might change if Trump jerks a knot in their tail with tariffs. Meanwhile, the oil fracking business in the U.S. is starting to go bust, according to this article. I've read stories over the last few years about how the Permian Basin oil fields in Texas and Oklahoma are all but emptied out now. The oil boom in the U.S. is just about over, and they know it. And they're not telling anybody really, which explains, which probably explains why the U.S. would be willing to stop the Europeans from buying cheap oil and gas from Russia in order to salvage what they can of the U.S. oil industry for as long as they can. Imagine some brilliant neocons in Washington, D.C., who came up with the idea of taking over the vast Russian oil fields by using the Ukrainians as a proxy military to defeat the supposedly incompetent Russian military. First, they helped remove their popular pro-Russian president in a coup back in 2014. Then he propped up Zelensky and pushed into the Ukraine with NATO military equipment, training their military, and so on, until Russia decided in 2022 to push back. We can all see how that worked out for the West. Western Europe is collapsing economically. National governments are collapsing because the economies are failing, and the people are getting very angry. How long before enough people decide that enough is enough, and they decide that the EU as a governing body is not meeting their needs and is dissolved? What will happen when European countries revert back to their original nationalistic governments from before the EU bloc? I mean, we're talking about going back 40 years. We see what happened to Britain when they left the EU. What if Germany, France, and Italy decide to leave? Italy probably would be one of the last ones to decide to go. But think about it. There's other countries over there that are kind of sitting on the edge. Germany is a very real possibility if the AFD coalition over there gets a stronghold. France, they're kind of sitting. They're sitting. They're kind of in the middle, don't know which way to go. So the idea is not that far-fetched right now, if you think about it. Why did Britain leave the EU? Immigration was their primary catalyst, and a lot of, fear-mongering. Not that leaving the EU changed their illegal immigrant woes, but it was the rallying cry for Brexit back then. And they failed miserably. Now, depending on who you look at, some say their economy is recovering slowly. There's others saying it's an absolute disaster. I don't know. I'll let you be the judge. The European continent is undergoing the same woes with immigration right now. There are too many mouths to feed, too many sick people to care for, not enough houses for them all, and the occasional jihadist who decides to randomly kill some Europeans out of some sick ideology. That scares the Europeans more than the lack of social services and housing for these refugees arriving on their shores. Will a lot of these refugees fleeing the wars in the Middle East and Africa be the spark that dissolves the EU so that the individual countries can close their borders? With all the economic upheaval happening because of the war in Ukraine, will that be the final straw that breaks the camel's back? It isn't that much of a stretch to our imaginations to visualize Europe's governments continuing to collapse in chaos over funding the war in Eastern Europe and trying to manage the massive influx of migrants fleeing to poverty and wars in the Middle East and African continent. Even more so since the U.S. seems bent on instigating a lot of that to their financial benefit. A short-term benefit for sure, but no one ever accused the American corporate world of thinking too far ahead. Their mantra has always been, take what they can as quickly as they can and move on to the next victim when their current one has been exhausted. With the Americans instigating coups and proxy wars in order to make their wealthy oligarchs richer, it's no wonder that the rest of the world is such a mess. Latin America is slowly crawling back from the mess the U.S. left them back in 1980s and 1990s. They are learning to not depend on the U.S. for anything other than theft of their resources, and they're moving on. Africa is violently moving away from the corruption left behind by their former colonizers. They're starting to make a little progress now, but they still got a long way to go. There's no doubt anymore that Russia will win in Ukraine. It's only a matter of time now, and it won't be too much longer before the Ukrainian military finally collapses. And this, anybody that knows anything knows this. I watched news video on RT News from Russia where two Ukrainian tanks came up on one Russian tank. It was leading a convoy of APCs, and personnel carriers. And the Russian tank took out the lead Ukrainian tank fairly quickly. And the other Ukrainian tank left the battle to be destroyed by drones a little while later. This is what the Russian army is contending with nowadays. A tired Ukrainian army with little stomach for any more fighting and not near enough training. Will the EU come to its senses and finally tell the Americans to piss off once enough of their economies and governments collapse altogether? As I said before, Britain may be a bit of a lost cause. They've got a lot of work to do to get themselves back up. And a lot of it is due to the Americans. The only thing seems to be holding them together is their special relationship with the Americans. The Australians and the Canadians are all still supportive of England because they're considered part of the Commonwealth, but not near enough to keep them afloat. How much longer do they have? It's anyone's guess. But I don't think they'll last till the end of this decade if they keep doing what they're doing. France is getting ready to undergo a massive political transformation. And Germany, well, maybe to a lesser degree, but it could be major. It all depends on what happens here in this next election. Will the rest of the Western European countries have makeovers as well once the powerhouses fail? Italy already has. And Greece is kind of sitting on the edge. They've been there on the edge since 2015. What will happen to Eastern Europe if the West reverts back to its nationalistic roots? It wouldn't take too much thinking to realize that quite a few Eastern European countries will slide over to the Russian Federation as long as they receive decent support from Russia. As in all things in the world, it's all about the money. Smaller Eastern European countries will quickly cozy up to the Russians once the EU dissolves. Who wouldn't? Cheap oil and gas, cheap imports from Russia and China. What's not to like? And that brings us to the future of the EU. Will they finally realize that the U.S. was never really their friend? When the realization hits them, will they move away from the Americans and the British to start trading more with the BRICS bloc? There are some obscure reports coming out of Europe that some countries and companies are taking a hard look at doing more business with China. Again, it's all about the money. Making money will always trump geopolitics every time, eventually. For some, that revelation comes a bit slower than others, but that's the nature of competition. Those who catch on quicker usually win out over the ones who resist over politics and ideology. Canada's prime minister has thrown in the towel this week, as everybody knows now, and decided to step down from his party's leadership and the prime minister job. His popularity has been severely diminished of late with his lack of handling things in Canada. The latest blow and the straw that likely broke the stack was his trip to visit Trump in his castle that was ridiculed everywhere, especially in Canada. He's staying on until they can find a replacement, but I suspect that won't take too long. How the mighty are falling to the United States. Germany, France, Canada, Italy kissing the ring. How many more will fall before it's all said and done? Speaking of which, I found another story on RT News about this ongoing rift between Trump and Denmark over Greenland. This is an opinion piece from a German historian who writes for RT now. And again, he writes for, every once in a while I'll see one of his pieces. He writes in his latest article about how so-called American allies had better watch out with Trump and his mafia notions about wanting things. In this case, other countries for himself meaning the United States. Trump was making up excuses, lies, about why he feels the need to incorporate these countries under the U.S. protectorate umbrella. In this case, he's using the same old tired trope of national security. He is lying to the world about he was lying to the world about there being Chinese troops in Panama, and that he needs to control Greenland to stop the Russians and Chinese from taking over the Arctic Circle. Denmark and Greenland are telling him no, but, as this writer says in the article, Trump doesn't act like he understands the word no. Will he try to punish Denmark and Panama or any other country for daring to stand up to him? It's beginning to look like it. Take a look at what just happened to Canada, and that's mild compared to what he thinks he can do to force smaller countries like Denmark and Panama to give him what he wants. Trump's latest remark at a press conference yesterday offered a glimpse into the Mafia Don's thinking. He says he's not adverse to using economic sanctions or military to take what he wants. What will Denmark do, or the EU for that matter, if Trump decides to forcibly take Greenland away from the governments of Greenland and Denmark? It's like a military invasion. What will Latin American countries do if Trump invades Panama and forcibly takes over the country in the canal? If these countries move over to the right and become more nationalistic, they might finally stand up to the Americans and tell them to take a hike. I expect the Germans and Canadians to do that this year once their new governments take over. Maybe France too, if Macron resigns. Mexico is going to try and play nice until Trump decides not to. Then they will go their own way too, which the new president of Mexico told them they would in the diplomatic letter late last year. What will happen to the Americans once these countries decide that their bottom line is more important than the imperial dictates of the U.S.? Will they impose high tariffs on the Americans? That depends on the American people. Americans, by and large, also live according to their bottom line. The last few national elections have shown that. The trouble is, the neocon oligarchs still own the majority of the mainstream media, so it will take them a little bit longer to finally figure it out that they're being conned in a very long game of thrones by the oligarchs running the United States. But once they finally get mad enough to do something about it, finally and decisively, the government in the U.S. will probably experience a makeover, much like the Europeans are going through right now. No one ever accused the Americans of being very quick on the uptake. In history, whenever something major like severe government changeovers happen elsewhere, the Americans don't take notice until it's all said and done, especially when it's the Americans who are instigating the changeover. Look how long it took the British and the Americans to figure out that Hitler and the Nazis were not going to be anyone's best friends. Will history repeat itself once again when the governments in Europe swing over to right-wing nationalism? How long before the Americans take notice? It took them 10 years to figure it out nearly 100 years ago. By 1939, it was too late. The bombs were already falling in Poland before anyone really woke up to what they were thinking. Could this happen again? If so, it won't be the Germans this time. But someone else could decide that they don't like their neighbors anymore, and that would be it. Think about how many little countries in Europe are mad about something right now. Austria, Serbia, Slovakia, Moldova, Hungary, and maybe a few others. How many of these would quickly make nice with the Russians at the slightest provocation, such as the collapse of the EU? I can safely say that every little country all the way up to the Polish and German borders will probably start talking to the Russians and asking, can we make a deal? I repeat, it's always about the money and the security of the people in any country. The smaller ones will go with whichever direction the stronger geopolitical wind is blowing. The larger ones will take a little longer, but eventually those with similar tendencies will follow. It's not too hard to imagine a dividing line in Europe someday where all of the Eastern European countries east of Romania, Bulgaria, and the eastern half of Moldova join the Russian Federation out of economic and physical security, and the Western European countries dissolve into bickering nation states fighting over the scraps left behind after their economies collapse. The U.S. will try to tough it out on their own for a little while until they eventually succumb to the isolation. Britain and the Commonwealth be no more. Australia will cleave off from England and become best buddies with China and its other neighbors in that part of the world. Latin America will have separated itself from its northern neighbors and moved on. This is one possible future of the developed world, which, given what is actually happening, could very well be the new reality in a few years. It doesn't need to be this dire. If the U.S. were to finally realize that, despite certain ideological differences, that they, the Chinese and the Russians, could actually learn to live with each other in a new multipolar world to the mutual benefit of all. Imagine what we could all accomplish together if we could all just learn to get along with each other. So that's all I've got for you as far as my commentary and analysis this week. So I'm going to take my break, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes to read the next chapter of The Priest. I want to take this minute to explain how you can support this podcast and to advertise my book. The podcast is free and can be found on these major mobile podcast apps, on my YouTube channel, and my Substack page at Crown and Beha, the Tree of Life at Substack.com. To help defray my cost, I'm asking for donations of any amount so everyone has an opportunity to watch or listen to this podcast anywhere in the world. I set up a donations tab at rss.com on the Village Oak Tree and on my website at www.crownandbeha.com, and all linked to PayPal for your security. This way you can use any currency you wish from around the world, providing PayPal is available to you in your country. So now let me tell you about my book. Fugitives in the New United States, which can be found on all major online book retailers around the world, comes in hardcover, paperback, and ebook version. You don't want to wait for them to print you one. You can also buy a hardcover or paperback edition from me directly through the bookstore page on my website, and I'll ship it right out to you. This is a dystopian fiction about what the United States might look like by 2031 under a Christian theocracy. It's full of drama, action, and romance, set against a backdrop of U.S. societal collapse. The story follows a trio of resistance fighters as they navigate across upper New England in their quest to escape from the authoritarian regime. So that's all I have here, and I appreciate any effort you can to support this endeavor that I'm doing, no matter how small it may be. Thank you very much. Welcome back. So now let me read to you another chapter from The Priest. Again, for anybody who's just tuning in for the first time, this is a ongoing story about what the United States might look like once the economy completely collapses and everything goes, up in smoke. So this is chapter 21. It's entitled The Priest, formerly known as Bob, by Michael Campy. To live and die in Ash Fork, Arizona. The kid, Tiki, has been awfully quiet since Dolly's awe-inspiring display of violence, and I'm hoping that he wasn't too traumatized by the event. I couldn't see anyone who's been through what he went through and being traumatized, but hell, I was kind of traumatized by it, and I thought the apocalypse had beaten all the trauma out of me. We were approaching Ash Fork, and the world was deathly quiet. Stuffy said that it was unusual for there to be no noise at all because the people who lived there were noisy all the time. Even when they sleep, asked Dolly. That's just it. They don't sleep. I don't think there was ever a time when I was with them that at least half of them weren't up and making noise. That's why this is weird. Dolly held his fist up, which I knew from movies about the military meant everybody stopped. So we stopped. Tiki looked dead on his feet, and he ran into me from behind when we stopped. I was tempted to smack him, but I didn't because I guess I'm a better person now who doesn't just go around smacking little kids. Why are we stopping? He asked. I don't know. Dolly, why are we stopping? Stuffy here thinks there might be a problem in Ash Fork. What kind of problem? He says it's too quiet. Wouldn't that be a good thing? I asked. He says it's never quiet, and he's never seen it quiet. Me and him are going to go up and take a look. I want you two to get over there behind those trees and wait for us. Why don't we all go? Because I'm a trained killer, and Stuffy knows the layout. What am I, chopped liver? You should feel fortunate that you're not chopped liver. Otherwise, we would have eaten you by now. At the word eaten, Tiki let out a yelp and ducked behind the cart. That is one weird kid, said Dolly. Eaten is a trigger word for him. He's delicate and sensitive, and you have to be careful about the language you use. He looked at me like I was crazy, turned and beckoned to Stuffy, and they began to walk towards Ash Fork. I truly hope that conversations with the priest don't get any weirder, he said. As they approached the town, they could see light coming from a fire, and Stuffy held up his fist. I always wanted to do that, he said. What's up? That fire up there is the central gathering point. If they're not asleep, then that's where they'll be. What would be the best approach if we wanted to take a look? Just to the right of the fire, there's a pile of old tires, and the path leading up there is pretty much covered by a bunch of shit that these guys dragged back with them. We should be able to get pretty close without them seeing us. Dolly and Stuffy crept through a mountain of trash that looked like something you would see in a hoarder's house if the hoarder had no space limitations and was out of his mind. Maybe a hoarder on steroids. As he got closer, they could hear a low moaning noise and smell something that smelled something like meat cooking. Stuffy peeked out first and quickly turned back and threw up, then peed himself. What the fuck? Whispered Dolly. That was one of my nicer dresses. Stuffy hadn't heard him because he had passed out. Fucking genius isn't worth a shit. Dolly stepped over Stuffy and peeked around the corner, and what he saw stopped him in his tracks. He had seen a lot of messed up things in his life, but what he was looking at was in the top 10 or maybe the top 5. 14 men were naked and ranged like spokes of a wheel around the fire. Their heads had been cut off, and they turned around so they appeared to be looking at what was in the middle. Their hands and feet had been removed, and the hands were where the feet used to be, and the feet were at the ends of the arms. In the middle of the fire pit, there was a type of metal frame, like something you would use to field dress an animal. Hanging from the frame was the source of the moaning. He had been impaled on a hook, and his feet and lower legs were cooking in the flames. He was still alive. Dolly pulled the knife from his boot and crept cautiously across the open space, staying low, keeping his head on a swivel. When he got to the fire, he stepped over one of the bodies and plunged his knife into the heart of the hanging man. Your war is over, he said, as he quickly moved back to where he had left Stuffy, who was just starting to come around. He grabbed him by the arm, pulled him up, and began to quickly move back towards the others. When they arrived back at the carts, he said, "We have to go now, and we have to go fast." "What is it? What's wrong?" I said. "Trust me." "What did you see?" "You don't want to know." "I kind of do. We need to go now." This is a little on the scary side. The people that were in Ash Fork are not an issue anymore because they're all dead. "That's a good thing, isn't it?" I asked. "No, we're not alone out here, and whoever or whatever killed those people is a lot worse than them, and it scares the shit out of me. We need to go," he said. And so that's all I have for you here this week. Appreciate you tuning in. I'm hoping that I brought some kind of enlightenment, some new stories that you didn't hear about before. For those of us who tune into this, and I appreciate you coming in and listening to me. So hopefully I'll have something for you here next week. With anything going on, I might have my buddy Mitch with me next week, and we'll talk about all the things that matter to you guys on a more personal level. So thank you for listening to the show today. I hope you enjoyed it, and you'll return again for more news and commentary about the world we live in. Please like, subscribe, and reply or share the videos or the audio podcast, however you watch and listen. The goal here is to resist the authoritarians who don't want to take our freedoms away from us. I appreciate everyone around the world, no matter where or who you are. Together, using independent media, we can resist the authoritarian oligarchs in the West. As I say goodbye this week, I wish to leave you with this Irish blessing as we go about our lives and try to stay warm in the meanwhile. May the year bring us all peace and prosperity, or at least enough of it to get us by for a time. Slán go foil.